Sarah Jama is co-founder of the Hamilton-based Disability Justice Network of Ontario, an organization that wants to create, quote, a world where people with disabilities are free to be, end quote. It's a powerful vision, one aimed at getting the needs of a wider spectrum of people into view and to help move us all past ableism. And we're pleased to bring Sarah Jama to our studio tonight. Hi, it's nice to have you here.
Hey.
I like what you're wearing. You got the bow tie
Thank you.
going. Same.
True.
But it's great to have you here in the studio.
I appreciate the invite.
You're a co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. What does your organization do?
So our mission is to create a world where people with disabilities are free to be. And so what that looks like for us is teaching young people with disabilities to be able to challenge institutions and community spaces that exist and say, hey, this is what we need in order to be able to participate as our full selves. So oftentimes people with disabilities are taught from a young age that you're a burden on society. So if you need support, you can go to this service or that service, but you're not taught to ask the critical question of, where do you go when the services that exist don't work for you? And so we're building the political capacity in young people to hold these institutions and community spaces responsible for the spaces that they create.
You're based right now in Hamilton.
Yeah.
Where did the idea for this organization come from?
So Hamilton has the largest density of people with disabilities across the province. So that's kind of why we're based in Hamilton. And the idea came from myself and my friend Shantia, who we were organizing politically on campus on a variety of different issues, whether it came to like the 15 in Fairness campaign or like women and gender equity issues on our campus, but disability perspectives were often left out. People think when you're talking about access and community organizing spaces, you need just a ramp to access like certain services, but disability intersects with so many different community movements that exist and is often left out. So like what? I would say that, for example, there are huge labor issues with regard to workers' rights in my city. We're a huge like industrial labor city, but you don't really see a focus on including people with disabilities in those conversations and those movements. Or when we talk about environmental justice, the conversation right now is stuck toward plastic straws, right? It should be about how do we create a world that allows people with disabilities to exist past this idea of our economic worth, right? We don't just want access to employment, which is what federal legislation is focused on, for example, because a lot of people with disabilities can't actually work. So what does it look like to build a community that actually fits us for our whole selves, and not just because some of us are able to produce and some of us can't?
And there's a distinction, correct me if I'm wrong, between accessibility and disability justice, is there?
Yes, so for me, I see a distinction, as well as the people who created disability justice, who are Sins Invalid from Oakland, and they are a bunch of queer, radical, Black organizers who came up with the term disability justice, because when people talk about accessibility, it's usually around how do we build a world around this pre-existing society that fits people with disabilities, but not from the sense of like, it's impossible to be completely independent, right? So it's a critique of the independent living movement. Everybody is interdependent upon each other, right? So your food just doesn't appear, it comes from grocery stores. Nobody's fully independent. So it's this idea that knowing that we're all relying sort of on each other, how do we build a society that's full, right? And fits everybody. So looking not just at employment, but looking at how do we interact with our justice system? How do we interact with our education system? How has our healthcare system hurt us, right? In a variety of different ways, and attacks our bodily autonomy. So I think when I think about disability justice, it's about critiquing these ideas that, you know, policing doesn't just hurt Black people, it hurts Black people with disabilities, right? Solitary confinement is a concept in Ontario that is against human rights, but still exists, and it's predominantly hurting people with invisible disabilities who are being incarcerated at extremely high rates, right? So how do we talk about this sort of leaving out of people with disabilities in our society from the standpoint of justice, as opposed to just, we need access to public space so that we can spend or expend economic purchasing power.
And well, let's use Hamilton as a case study. How do you connect the issues as an activist that move you and drive you to the outcomes that you want to see?
Mainly through understanding that a lot of our issues are interconnected, right? So when I was on campus, one of the first things I did is I signed up for every single club on campus.
And that was at McMaster, right?
Yeah. I signed up for over 300 clubs just to get an idea of what people were interested in outside of what I was just interested in. Because I understand that fighting for Indigenous rights, fighting for Palestinian solidarity, all of these issues are interconnected to this idea that certain people are allowed to exist in our society over others, right? And so the key to that in any sort of movement is questioning that underpinning ideology of like, why are certain people allowed to exist and other people are left out? And that includes Black people, queer people, racialized people, people with disabilities. And I also have this understanding that people with disabilities fit every race, religion, geographic location, everywhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, but these issues are often left out of every movement because it's not normally talked about. And I think, yeah, I have this understanding that in order to build toward a society that fits everybody, we have to start centering the most vulnerable. And so for me, that often means, instead of pulling people into my movements and what I believe is important, being able to move into different spaces like labor, like environmental justice, and bring that lens with me. So it's like, it's present in all of these different spaces. Yeah, exactly.
As a community organizer, you're working at the grassroots level. What do you think can be accomplished at the grassroots level that can't be at government level?
So that's a really good question. I'm thinking of like Mike from Acorn Hamilton, who at the grassroots level, he is a tenant who's experiencing a variety of different issues, yet he's able to build capacity in people in his building to hold his like landlord accountable for the spaces that are harming people's ability to live in safe environments, right? And he's literally building that capacity in other people. I'm thinking of Ursula, who's involved with the Campaign for Adequate Welfare and Disability. It's like a racialized Caribbean woman who relentlessly shows up and holds people accountable for the spaces that they create too. And I think what we have in Hamilton on the grassroots level is a mass amount of relationships and community trust that doesn't exist at government level because they're so separate from people's lived experiences, right? And they don't see that a single policy can have such drastic effects on people's lives, or maybe they do see it and they don't care.
Well, speaking of policy, a few months ago, former Lieutenant Governor David Onley was here to talk about his review of the Ontario's Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The act was enacted in 2005 with promises of making Ontario fully accessible by 2025, which is just around the corner. And this is what he had to say about what life is like here for people living with disabilities. Let's take a look.
You have some pretty strong language in your report, and I want to read just one phrase here, because you compared services that disabled people now cannot access to the water fountains or the restaurants that African Americans were prohibited from using in the Deep South because of what was effectively apartheid in the Deep South 50 years ago. That is a tough comparison. Why do you feel it's apt?
Because it's deliberate. Not deliberate to discriminate, but it's deliberately placed on the basis of perception of aesthetic design as opposed to meeting the needs of some 20% of the population.
Do you agree with his assessment?
I believe hit the heart of his assessment in terms of what he's saying. This idea that we're going to be accessible by 2025 is a complete fallacy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I also think, too, that the assertion that it's difficult to make, we don't need to make race comparisons because there are Black people with disabilities that exist that have been left out systemically more so than other groups of people with disabilities. It's a lot harder to access services. And like, if we're gonna have a conversation around true accessibility, it's not enough to just make comparisons to, you know, treatment around water fountains. Let's talk about Abdurrahman Abdi, a man in Ottawa who was Black and killed by police, right? Let's talk about Solomon Fikiri, a Muslim man, person of color, who was killed by prison guards in Lindsay, Ontario. Let's have real conversations around the nuances around race and disability versus leaving it at that. But at the same time, I get the principle of what he's saying in that, you know, the government's not taking accessibility seriously enough and needs to do a lot more work to make sure that we're building a province that literally fits our most vulnerable people.
Well, in your view, what do you think is wrong with that act?
There's a lot, but I think it has no teeth. You can't just say on principle that we're going to have an accessible province and not put your money where your mouth is. There's not enough investment in making sure people are being supported financially in businesses and organizations in order to make our province accessible. And instead of addressing this, we have a premier and a government that has given $1.3 million to the Rick Hansen Foundation in a strange public-private sort of partnership so that they can create arbitrary checklists of what's accessible and what's not. And what we're seeing in BC is they're actually charging organizations to receive this sort of assessment. And instead of doing that, we should, and that's what we're doing in Ontario, is the government gave $1.3 million to the Rick Hansen Foundation. Instead of doing that, we need to be directly investing in ways that is going to incentivize businesses to become accessible, right? And not just giving money to an organization that's going to police that, but really making it easier to access these resources, right? And we also have to make sure that we're taking into consideration more than just employment. A lot of AOTA is framed around consumerism, right? I need access to a source so I can buy something, right? And my economic benefit. But what about the people with disabilities who can't work? Do they still have the right to exist in public spaces? And I'm not clear that AOTA goes far enough. We need to be thinking beyond just AOTA, right? Otherwise, we'll continue to be let down over and over again by this government.
How much of this is about the general public who go about their day because the spaces are designed for those with, for people with able bodies, like for us?
There is a culture change that needs to exist, but honestly, the government is doing so much to harm people's basic rights, like the rollback of the Basic Income Pilot Project, which a predominant amount of people with disabilities were on in Hamilton, right? The rollback of that, the cuts to ODSP, the changes to OW, like all of these systemic changes are saying over and over again that it is our government who does not want people with disabilities to exist freely and equally in our society. And so until we change that, until we stop being attacked from people in positions of power to implement those policy changes, I don't really care about the culture or the one-on-ones, right? I want to make sure that systemically we're making those changes, right? Because I could talk to my teachers or my friends about their attitudes, but what do I care about attitudes if I still have to go to a food bank? You know what I mean?
Well, in that review too, Mr. Onley said that with the law, it does not currently define what is meant by accessibility. Why is that problematic?
It's problematic because there are so many different kinds of accessibility, right? There are people with visible and invisible disabilities. Like there are millions of people with disabilities in our province, and it doesn't mean one specific thing to people, right? So we need to start making sure that our definitions are reflective of people's actual experiences versus having policymakers try to define things that they don't understand or don't experience themselves.
Well, last year you gave a talk called "We All Deserve the Right to Life," and I have a clip from it. Please roll.
Think back to grade 9 when I was so excited to be given a spare in place of gym, because the school I was at the time didn't have proper supports to support me in physical education. But what that meant in the long run was that I was also missing critical education around sexual health that the rest of my peers received. And I know now that women with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and to not learn about their sexual health and their rights up until their mid to late 20s. Gee, I wonder why that is.
As you say in that clip, it was fun to have a spare instead of gym, instead of gym class. But looking back, what was the personal impact for you of not participating in gym class?
Like myself and a lot of young people who are, told by their teachers, like, oh, we don't have the capacity to help you, so we're going to give you a spare because we can't adequately help you participate. The impact of that is that you lose out on critical pieces of sexual health education, right? So various forms of, segregation will happen within the school system. I was told by my grade 7 teachers that I was a liability and couldn't go on an overnight trip, right? So these constant sort of ideas that you're a burden or you should be separated or you don't really quite fit, it follows you and it teaches you as a young person with a disability that you are a burden on society.
That has to hurt.
Yeah, it did. It did. But I was able to quickly understand that through being a little bit radical in my undergrad and like I said, organizing with a bunch of different communities and sort of figuring out, okay, what is my place in the struggle? I learned that these issues aren't about me as an individual, and I can't continue to be hurt as an individual, right? Because it's tied to a history of people with disabilities being left out in our society. It's tied to the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots, where people were literally taken from their parents and their homes and put into institutions. It's tied to like the treatment of people at the Rossi McDonald School of the Blind, where kids were allegedly forced to drink their own pee out of urinals.
This is
right?
in Canada.
Yes, in Ontario. It's tied to whole histories of people being removed from their homes and treated very poorly and sexually abused in these institutions, physically abused, buried at the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots without even their names. They were just given numbers, right? So I know it's not about me. I know it's about a society and a country that is predicated on this idea that some people don't have the right to exist. And I know, for example, my lack of sexual health education is tied to the Alberta Sterilization Act, an entirely, government condoned act that said that people with disabilities would be forcibly sterilized against their will, knowledge, or consent, right? So, yeah, it hurts, but I also understand that it's not just me we're talking about. We're talking about millions of people who are also feeling the same way and don't have the ability to say something or try to do something. So, yeah.
For the first time in 14 years, last year, the Ontario Human Rights Commission updated its education policy for people with disabilities and concluded that significant barriers still exist in education. The Canadian Press reported on the issue this way. At the core of the Commission's policy, Chief Commissioner Renu Mandane said, is a call to shift the way disabled students are viewed by those who work with them. The current model for special education starts from a premise of exceptionality or the idea that students with disabilities are the exception to the normal student. We need to start from the beginning, designing inclusively rather than relying on one-off accommodations to deal with the varied needs that students have. How important is it to accommodate each student individually?
I think it's super important to accommodate students individually while also having, systemic analysis is in place in these institutions. I also think it's important to teach disability history in our school systems. It's ridiculous to me that I had to self-teach and learn in post-secondary about the history of the treatment of people with disabilities in my province, right, in my city. So I think, individual sort of IEPs are important, but systemic analysis is important as well as understanding the history of people with disabilities.
Tell me about the advice that you were given when you were in grade 12 about what you should do after you finished high school.
Yeah, I was told to take a 5th year. I was told also that I should go to college instead of university. And I think that happens to a lot of people, not just with disabilities, but also racialized people.
The
right?
streaming, right?
Yeah.
And you ended up doing what?
I ended up going to McMaster University. Actually, my mom studied with me. She actually enrolled the year after I did, so it was really nice.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. But I did make it to university. I studied social psychology, but left with a social sciences degree. I ended up learning more outside of campus than I did in campus because it was hard for me to pick up a sociology book and read about the stats that affected me versus working in my local community to try to figure out how to affect change. And so, yeah, I really, really valued going to post-secondary, but also being in that space.
How did you, because in the talk that, the clip I showed earlier, in that same talk, you spoke about how from a very young age, you didn't feel as if you had autonomy to your body through the medical system, and then when you went to school. How did you get from that point to what you're doing now and having an organization that advocates for, I think you could have used something like that when you were younger.
Yeah, how did I get here? I think I just started to believe in my own power and the power of collectivity of people around me. So again, when I look at the organizing that people are doing in Hamilton through ACORN or through Environment Hamilton and groups that are constantly working to better the lives of people around them, I think to myself, why can't I do that too, right? And it also comes from having my mom and family members around me who consistently reminded me that I have value in what I say and what I think, and that I shouldn't let anybody tell me no. And mentors too, right? Constantly having mentors just to remind me of that.
Young people are often portrayed as being politically disengaged. We began our conversation with your own grassroots organizing. How do you empower young people to affect change when it's politicians who are making the decisions?
Politicians are I see politicians as movable, right? And anybody who thinks that politicians can't be held accountable doesn't understand how politics works. So for example, our youth council for the Disability Justice Network, they decided that they wanted to take on a snow removal campaign. Because in my city, even though we have a large density of people with disabilities, snow removal is cleared in Ancaster, where people with more income live, but not in the downtown core. So they were like, we got to do something. They created an online campaign. It was just like literally 4 of us with a banner and asked people to tweet in photos of snow that wasn't cleared that was creating barriers. And this created so much dialogue in our city that 2 youth council members wrote 2 different op-eds on the conversation for the very first time. They had meetings with 2 counselors and were able to get a motion moved to consider snow removal in the 2020 budget cycle on council. And that was in a matter of like 4 weeks or less. And it's this idea that, you know, politicians are the almighty. They're not. We put them there and they're accountable to us. And so having that critical understanding is how you get things changed.
Do you think that, I guess, people who are not young people we need to change our mindset when it comes to young people? Because as we're speaking, the work that you're doing is incredible. And there's been a huge youth movement around what's been happening with the changes in education. And it's been young people who are leading that fight. So do you think that there's a misconception that young people are not politically engaged?
I think it's worse than that. I think people treat young people as though they're not intelligent. I asked my nephew a couple weeks ago, I was like, Mikhail, what's something that you want to work on when you're older? He said, the environmental crisis. I was like, why? Because to me, it's like, I've never heard him really talk about that before. And he was like, because it affects my generation. It affects people like us. So that would be the one issue I would want to take on. People are aware, young people are aware of what's going on. They're very intelligent. And that if we ask them what they think the solutions are, they will answer. So it's more than just asking them to be political. It's remembering that they're even in this space to begin with.
Well, you mentioned of some of the cuts that have been enacted with the new Ontario government. What would you say has been the most detrimental towards the community of people living with disabilities?
There's been so many. There's been a lot. I would say the one that people are talking about significantly is the changing definition to the terminology around disability, who fits and who doesn't. A lot of communities are saying that they're afraid that it's going to leave out people with episodic disabilities, disabilities that flare up, and also the offloading onto municipalities in terms of like the decision around who is able to apply for ODSP and who isn't, will allow for less nuance, like more power on, you know, people on the ground, so individuals, to make decisions in terms of like which applications to accept and which to deny. So these are very real worries that people have right now. And so the Campaign for Adequate Welfare and Disability in Hamilton has been hosting clinics to help people sign up for ODSP before the changes are rolled out. There's that, but I also think what was most detrimental in Hamilton was the rollback of the Basic Income Pilot Project in our city, because it affected a lot of people with disabilities.
If you could have a few minutes with the government, what would you tell them?
I don't need a couple minutes with the government. We need to get them out. I think I don't think the government as it stands, I don't believe that the decisions they're making are in good faith, and I don't believe it's possible to negotiate with them at this point. They've made so many decisions that show me their values. And their values are, they don't believe that people with disabilities have the right to exist freely in our society. Not only that, but people in poverty, right? People who have way less than they do as individuals. They're not able, they don't have the capacity to think in that way. So the only solution I see is to get them out of government.
And what role do you see your organization playing for people who might not be able to have any other assistance?
Right. So we have a research committee, but we also have a campaigns committee. So what we do is we meet, bi-weekly, and we decide what are the priorities in terms of things that you want to work on. The priorities that people have decided locally are talking about WSIB and the failures there with regard to protecting injured workers. Talking about, you know, the ADP campaign. The assisted devices program right now leaves a lot of people with disabilities out because devices like my wheelchair or walkers or hearing aids aren't treated as integrated into our healthcare system. It's in the side piece with additional costs.
So you have to pay for it yourself?
You have to pay for some of it yourself or wait like months and months and months to even hear back from the ADP because there's so much backlog, like they're months behind. There's not enough funding and enough resources. And often they don't provide loaners. So if you're in repairs, they don't cover repairs at all. So if my wheelchair breaks, you pay for it. And they don't, if you're in hospital or waiting for your thing to be repaired, they also don't cover that. So there's so many gaps because it's not treated as an integrated piece of our healthcare system. So right now we're working on those two things over the summer. And we take on issues as people identify them versus setting the priorities ourselves.
Do you have any advice for young people with disabilities who may be trying to figure out how to navigate the system and maybe facing similar challenges?
Remember that you're part of a large community. The way systems are built right now is to teach you and to make you feel isolated, that you're alone and you're not alone. You have whole communities behind you and histories of people that fought for your right to even access education or whatever space that you're occupying. So just remember that you have a voice, you have capacity to, you know, create the change that you want to see.
Well, when it comes to creating change, it does help if you are in office. Do you see a need for more young people with disabilities running for office?
100%. There's definitely a need for more people of various class backgrounds, people with disabilities, racialized people to take up these seats. So that's a good question. If I'm saying we need to get rid of the government, definitely I think these are the people that should be replacing the government.
Sarah, it's been great having you here. You've given us a lot to think about and to consider. We appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.